David, what are we?
Shut up.
David.
Mike's got a good haircut. Do I take him back?
David and I are grown-up adults. David.
Speaking of David, he is here. Let's bring him in the box. We're going to shift the live setting. What's up, David?
Hello.
Let me just change this. We're going to go like this for our chat today.
Oh, nice. Yeah, it was Kiara going to come?
She might join us a little bit later.
Okay. I'm going to set a timer just because I went a lot longer on my live today than I had anticipated. And so I'm going to set a timer for 2 hours. I think that gives us a pretty ample time. I would hope we get somewhere in 2 hours, right?
Here's hoping. Have you seen everything on my board? Do I even need to have the board up? Or can I just remove the board?
Yeah, you can just remove the board.
Okay.
It's up to you. I after our conversation earlier, I wrote down a bunch of things.
Beautiful. All right.
So I'm mostly just setting this for me so I don't get lost in the conversation. And then I look down and it's like 11 o'clock and I still got a bunch of stuff I need to do.
No worries. I will also, I'm not going to set a timer, but I'm going to get up my Google Docs so I can make sure I can write down everything you say so I don't misrepresent anything that ever comes out of your mouth. I don't like misrepresenting people.
Yeah, the good old TikTok straw man is oh so prevalent in many of these conversations.
No straw mans today. We're gonna go no straw.
I'm not saying by you, just like in general on debate talk.
I've straw man all the time. I'll straw man to make a point.
Yeah.
Let me put it that way. I'll definitely straw man to make a point.
Yeah. So I tend to be pretty. I try to be pretty mellow, like melancholy when debating, just so I try to detach myself emotionally, just so there's not like emotional offense in just like little things in conversation, right?
I get full emotional depending on the topic, so let's get ready for that.
Say it again?
I'll go full emotional depending on the topic.
Oh yeah, no, that is entirely your prerogative too, right? I'll say whenever I talk about religion, like theology, and like especially like Christology, I get very passionate, and so I mean it's understandable when things are important to you that you care about them, right?
I would expect nothing less. Now
Yeah,
I'm eating my pre-debate glizzy.
No worries. I just got done from a shortened run, so I'm still a little bit out of breath anyways.
That's the difference between you and me, David. Running sounds like the devil.
Yeah, I like to. I just kind of always get like bored, like stagnant if I don't like challenge myself, at least physically for me. And so I recently started doing Spartan races, which are like 5K, 10K, and 21Ks, but with obstacles in them. So it's like some of them have like 18 obstacles, some of them got like 25, and it's just like rope swings and climbing and just
You're
different.
Do all that?
Yeah, I've already done one
David.
A couple months ago, but I've got one on Sunday that I'm preparing for.
Well,
and so I'm excited.
I wish you luck on that.
That
sounds like the worst thing in the world to me. So.
Oh, it is. It is for me too. While I'm doing it, I'm like all the hateful thoughts I've ever thought about myself are just frontal lobe, and it's brutal. But when you're done, it's unique, rewarding, just like accomplishing something that was so physically challenging, right?
I'm sure. Not
yeah, and we're just different, right? I played sports my whole life. I'm
a theater kid. I was not on a sports ball team.
Different, just different groups of people and different like kind of desires. Really, I mean, you would rather probably spend your time inside, like watching a musical and like talking about it with like a group of your friends, right?
1000%. That is absolutely correct.
My ex-girlfriend was actually a theater girl, or one of my ex-girlfriends was a theater.
Hey, yo, Hell's Bells, that's so cool. That was dope. I never saw that one before.
Was it like a DJ table? I got
It's
the
a little
very end of it.
computer.
Oh, that's sick.
All right,
So-
David. I will give you the opening floor.
Okay.
We get a Parker raid. Hey, what's up, Parker raid? Welcome to the debate today. It's me and David. I will. Damn, a little hot, that little glizzy gobble. I'll give you the opening floor, David. To you know my topics, and I'm sure you've got some you want to touch on. So whatever you want to talk about first.
Yeah. So, which one should we start on first?
By the
You
way,
responded to a
I do
video.
I also want to just say again. I just want to say again. We are very proud of David. He has come a long way since he was in
Yes.
my comments months ago. So I want to commend David for unlearning his transphobia. We love him for that.
Yes, it was. And in a lot of ways, it was of no fault of my own. Just purely me not being in the culture. I didn't understand a lot of what goes through the minds and even hearts of people in the LGBT community in general, right? I just never knew a lot of them, so I never really got to understand them, like why they felt the way that they feel or anything like that. And so, out of that ignorance, I was very susceptible when like propaganda would say like, "Hey, they're trying to put strip club drag shows at all these elementary schools." It's like I see like extreme headlines where they're blowing shit way out of freaking proportion, and even sometimes just blatantly giving misinformation. And I would see it and I'd be like, "Oh my gosh, like I don't know anything about them, so that sounds like it could be reasonable."
We love to see it.
Real.
All right, well,
And
David,
so-
go ahead. Floor is all yours. Sorry I interrupted. I just wanted to commend you on that. But
Yeah.
floor is all yours.
Appreciate it. Yeah, the video that you responded to in your video earlier, I think, was talking about how a lot of pro-choicers will. I see like a lot of pro-choicers on here arguing whether or not it's a human life or not. And I would say that just purely like scientifically speaking, that because it can be defined.
Sorry,
because
they're mad
even
that I'm not
a-
acknowledging the Parker raid. I acknowledge you, Parker raid. Hello, Parker raid.
yeah,
Love you.
no worries. If you need to address your chat, because I know you also stream on Twitch and stuff too. I'm
We're live on
perfectly
Twitch
fine if
now.
you-
No, don't worry, Parker
Yeah,
raid.
so
Hello,
don't-
love you,
don't-
Parker raid. Keep going, David.
Don't worry about that. When it comes to like something that is like an organism that can be classified as living, it has to be moving and growing, I believe, are two of like the key characteristics. I don't know the exact definition, but like moving and growing are characteristics that are fundamental to it. And therefore, if it is a if the zygote is living, it can be classified as living, then it would be, because it's a human zygote, it would be a human life. So it's like, in my opinion, it's like the debate is not whether or not when life begins. I believe that the debate starts at where do rights begin, and that's where the real debate is. That I feel like a lot of like inexperienced debaters on TikTok, I guess, frame their argument around the prior versus just acknowledging that it's a human life and then debating on whether or not it has rights, especially rights that supersede that of the mothers. And so I think that's where the debate should be. And I would say that a fundamental right of humans is the right to life, to live. And when it comes to pregnancy, because now obviously there's a very clear exception to this, but because the woman caused the pregnancy, they therefore would not have the right to freely do what they want with it, unless obviously her life was at risk. So, like, if
And life at risk, is that the only exception that you make in that instance?
the health, I wouldn't even say life. I would say the exception. I'll make my position even more painstakingly clear instead of just trying to go around it like that. I believe that there should be zero legislation regarding the female body. Therefore, because there should be no legislation that is regulating the body, it would be inappropriate to regulate when an abortion can be performed during a pregnancy. It's like if we say 5 months, well, then you're regulating a natural process within the female body. So I think it's wrong. I think that we should be more clear on the rights of the mother and the rights of the fetus, and then make sure that our doctors operate within like an ethical framework to ensure like what's the word? It's a concept of consequentialism.
Mm-hmm.
It basically means like doing the most for the best for the most amount of people and minimizing suffering.
Okay.
I can't think of the word. I'm sure somebody in the chat knows. The basis of it is to minimize suffering to the most we can.
I get you. No worries.
And that's where I personally would trust the doctors and the mother to make that distinction. And a hell of a lot more than politicians.
Okay. So let me just give you my view on abortion, and then we can like talk about each other's views there. I think we're actually very similar in our practical application of our abortion views. I very much believe the only person that should be able to make a choice regarding abortion should be the pregnant person and their doctor. I don't believe anybody else should be able to make that decision. I don't even think that the other party involved in the pregnancy should be able to make that decision. I think only the person who is pregnant and their doctor, that's it. Now, I agree. I think there shouldn't be any, like you said, there should be zero regulation or legislation regarding it. I think at max we can have one legislation saying there shall be no legislation, but like, I don't think there should be any legislation in regards to abortion at all. Very much, I base my stance very much off of the model that's currently in Canada. I think we definitely have different views on like the moral implications of abortion. I believe that anything prior to 24 weeks is completely and utterly moral, and there's no way for me to believe that it could be any less. My stance of abortion is a mix of a couple things, predominantly being moral obligation for consciousness and then bodily autonomy. So I use both of those sort of interchangeably. So I believe that you can absolutely qualify it as a life prior to birth. At conception. I absolutely believe that we can say it's a life, and I believe that most people would agree it is a human life. I would just disagree on whether it's a human being or not. I would really want to look at
personhood.
Exactly. I would really want to look at like, is this a person? And if it's not a person, I really don't have a moral quandary with killing a body. Because I believe that we've already set a precedent in human society that bodies kind of come and go. What we really care about is that subjective, conscious human experience. So that's really where I go. Now, when we get into like the rights thing, I believe that you can give it whatever rights you want at birth. Like you can give it the right to life, but that doesn't mean it has the right to the resources necessary to sustain its life. Specifically, if those resources come from another person, but we'll get into that as we like do our back and forth.
Okay. Yeah, that goes into like I'm assuming like breast milk would be that going down that like giving her resources post birth.
Yes, she as long as you can consent to it, you can give whatever resources you want. It just has to be consensual. I don't believe those resources can be taken by an entity. They have to be consensually given.
Okay. Yeah, and I think that is we have the liberty to do that now, because of the advancements we've made to be able to have formula, right? Like 100 years ago, that may not have actually been a stance that we could take because formula didn't exist, right? I don't know if there was ever, I don't know when formula was invented or like that.
This is why we needed a fact checker.
Yeah.
I don't know. I don't know when it was invented. Google's telling me 1865, so actually 100 years ago, you've been just fine.
Okay. Yeah. So I mean, but prior to that, that's irrelevant. That was just something I noticed, just how as a society our morals can progress because of
I would agree.
technology.
I would agree
I
with
just
that.
made that correlation in my head. And so you would directly correlate personhood with rights, if I'm understanding your position correctly.
So me personally, yes, I view rights as a unspoken contract between two sentient beings. Without sentience, I believe you have no use for rights. And they don't really play a factor into, because like I wouldn't say that I'm killing somebody if there is no somebody. So like there aren't like what right the only rights that I would say you have prior to sentience and consciousness are the rights prescribed to you by your value to people. So like we would give fetuses rights in regard to their value to a pregnant person. So that's why like if you unalive whatever TikTok a person who's like under 24 weeks pregnant, usually you only get charged with the involuntary termination of a pregnancy as opposed to like a double homicide.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So and so you so there's a value change of rights in terms of like legality, like we assign different value to life at different stages.
Yes, I mean we absolutely prescribe
Yeah,
different value.
and
to life
I
at
would
different
agree.
stages,
I'm not, and
yeah.
I'm just so you know, I'll never be like trying to like gotcha. I'm genuinely just trying to have uh, a fluid conversation. So
Yeah,
if I
absolutely.
ever feel like um, and so when it comes to assigning value to rights, I I think there are certain rights that value is not relevant to. Right? Like would you say like the right to life, like to be to live and to not be unalived, uh, would be something that doesn't need value to be true?
No, not really. No, I would actually say that the right to life might need more value than any other right. Like if I'm just thinking like off the top of my head, because if not for value, right, I would say you it doesn't really matter what we do. So like in regards to moral consideration in that sense, a person who is brain dead, right? I would say because they've lost the thing, not that they don't have value, but because they've lost the thing that we value as a species, there is no
Mm.
need to keep them alive. You're not hurting anyone by taking them off of life support, right? You're not causing any harm. You're effectively reducing harm. So like because they've lost the piece of humanity that we value, that's what I would say. And I think it's the same with a fetus. They need to gain that piece that we value. And then I'll grant them whatever rights, we want to grant them as people.
Yeah, but don't you think that there are rights that hmm, I'm just trying to track with you and respond appropriately.
Yeah, for sure.
But for rights, for moral consideration,
Mm-hmm.
how do you differentiate what you give more or less moral consideration to when it comes to a human life? Because
I think.
because
Oh yeah, go ahead.
because I would give equal moral consideration to all human life. I mean, in terms of them being a human being, like even a corpse, I would say that the vessel of your consciousness, as much as your consciousness is deserving of rights, which you're saying like your sentience
Mm-hmm.
is what your personhood is what gives you rights. I would say that the vessel of that sentience is equally as important because the sentience wouldn't exist without the vessel and vice versa.
So I would disagree slightly, especially when we look at how we're advancing technology wise. Like, let's say, and this is going to be a hypothetical. It's going to be a science fiction hypothetical. But what I always like to look at
I
is,
love hypotheticals.
great. I always like to look at like the robot problem, right? Like, let's say we invent the ability to take our conscious mind and put it in a robot. It's no longer in our body, it's in a robot operating a robot. Well, now who is you? Are you the body that's left behind, lifeless and unable to move, unable to think, unable to do all of that? Or are you the robot? And then take it a step ahead. What if we take somebody who's unable to, like somebody who's unable to move their body, right? They're fully in a catatonic state, but their brain works, and put their brain in me. Are they now me, or are they just them in a different body?
Yeah, that's why I think they're both equal. They're connected. They don't like intrinsically, and so they would have the same value.
Well, no. What I'm saying is we have to look at like what we place the value on, and what I think we place the value on is the conscious mind. Because I would argue if somebody else's consciousness comes into my body, they're not me. They're not Jovan. They're somebody else. Now, the body still might have some utility, so we would place value on it based on
utilitarianism.
Yeah, so we would go
That's
down
the word I was looking for.
Yeah. Okay. Oh, that. Yeah. We would go down the utilitarianism route because that body still can serve a purpose. But in where we are now in science, when that body can no longer serve a purpose or hasn't started serving a purpose, why the thing I always like to ask is, why should I consider a fetus like it already has that personhood prior to that? Why shouldn't I? Why should I value the thing that it doesn't have yet?
Because we know with good certainty that it will eventually, right?
So I worry though when we get into potential arguments,
Yeah.
right? Because then like that we can go wherever we want. Because what we're talking about then is like the potential for human life. Right? It has the potential to become a human being. But like I can take that super far back. I can take that back even further than sperm.
It's like sperm has the potential.
You can go back further. When a man meets a woman and they love each other very much, all of a sudden the potential for human life explodes. So that's why I worry about potential.
Yeah,
I always
potential is a slippery slope. You can take it
exactly,
and then you can take it even further. Yeah. So when it comes to so it doesn't have consciousness, but I still find it hard to place value at different phases, like as like an inherent value, not like a subjective value. Because like I can find you more valuable than Joe, or and vice versa, right? Like not not like that sort of value, but like a intrinsic value, because it seems like at the earliest stages of development, because of its dependency and location, it is not granted the same rights as any other stage of development, because there are certain, like the right to life is something that a born baby has permanently. So why do we not? At what point? Like, is it just viability? Is that the solution?
Well, I believe it's at 24 to 28 weeks, because that's when the cerebral cortex forms and you're able to have the capacity to have conscious thought, right? The part of your brain that controls that is here. And now it takes a while for that brain to really like it's working, and it's working out these problems. It just takes a while for it all to click in, and for like, the mirror test for you to finally go, oh shit, I'm a person. Like it's going to take a while for it. But like the capacity and the start of it working starts about 24 to 28 weeks. So like to be safe, I usually just say 24, like just on the low end. But I think we already as people inherently look at different stages of life and place different value on it. Right? There's a reason why if we take the trolley problem, for example, and you've got the trolley running down the tracks to a kindergartner and running down the tracks to an 85-year-old man, you're most likely going to switch it so the kindergartner can live, right? Like we do place different value at different stages. The only difference is we're trying to figure out where we should start placing that value. So
that is the question, right?
Yeah, that's where we get into a little bit of our disagreements, right? I believe that because we stop the value at consciousness, I think we have to start the value at consciousness. I don't think we can start the value in a place different than we end the value.
See, but we don't stop the value at consciousness.
We do,
because corpses have rights.
Well, so
You cannot sodomize a corpse.
Corpses only have rights like in a respectful way. We don't give them like they don't have the same type of rights that like people have. And a lot of the times, mostly corpse rights are because of like the family and stuff. So you pay respect to the family by not violating the corpse and things like that. But when it comes to whether the corpse can live, right? Like that's why we talk about brain dead people a lot, because it's the same sort of thing. Because that consciousness is no longer there, we recognize that even if the body is still alive and we could keep it alive on life support indefinitely, we give doctors discretion to pull the plug, even sometimes when the family doesn't want to, because we recognize that the thing we value, the consciousness, is not coming back. And that's the same reason why with comas, we don't pull the plug, because we have a lot of evidence to show that comatose patients are still conscious. There are a lot of times where comatose patients...
They can wake up.
Yeah, they wake up. They've woken up and been able to recite whole conversations people had in the room when they were in a coma. Mm-hmm. So we recognize that their brains are still working. But the second that brain is dead, we pull the plug. That's why I like to talk about ask the question why I should value a human body over a human being. Because I think they're two very different things. And I think a fetus can't even begin to become a human being until about 24 weeks.
So I'm going to pose a hypothetical for you.
Mm-hmm.
It's an extreme one. But I think it makes the point. If a girl is passed out for whatever reason, she is unconscious and will not wake up at a party, but she's still alive, and somebody essays her, but then she's not sore afterwards. She doesn't even know it happened. She wakes up the next morning thinking it was all good, like nothing happened. Would you think that it was wrong?
Yes.
So
because the reason I would hold on,
because it's her body.
Yes, but the reason I would is because just because you're asleep doesn't mean your conscious mind isn't still working. Right, like the subconscious is your like dreaming, like your conscious mind.
She wasn't asleep; like she was unconscious, knocked out on drugs. Like she was unconscious.
Even unconscious. I think like when we look at the loss of consciousness, I look at two specific things. I look at, did they have previous consciousness, and will that previous consciousness return? If they have previous consciousness, right, I'm going to respect that, and it is going to return. I'm going to respect their body in this paused state. I'm going to give them the respect that they asked for when they were previously awake. That's why, like, I would, if somebody signs a DNR, when they were previously conscious, they specified they didn't want to be brought back, so I would respect that decision that they made when they were previously conscious. So because when she was previously conscious, she didn't want to be SA'd, I would say you can't SA her when she is in a brief period of unconsciousness.
Yeah, that's fair, but it's like if she were and she lived the rest of her life and she never knew. All that what the violation was of her body, because she never knew. She never learned about it. She lived 80 more years afterwards and never learned about it. And so I would say that the violation was, I mean, I understand, and obviously this is not like my rational belief, right? Like, but it's like along this line of thinking, it's like her body was the only thing adversely affected.
Yes, but she still has bodily autonomy, and she gets to determine, while she's conscious, while she has a conscious human mind, she gets to determine what happens to her body.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Okay, yeah, that makes sense. Okay. Yeah, because then and that's like goes along. That's why you went into the DNR. Okay, now I'm connecting the dots. Sorry, my brain is tired. I shouldn't have done my live knowing that I was going to come on here.
It's all good.
Is it? And I just don't know. I'm going to look it up as I ask this. Is it illegal to move a corpse?
Not necessarily. It depends on the situation. Like if my grandfather dies in his bed, it wouldn't be illegal for me to move him down the stairs into the living room for the the paramedics to take him to the morgue, right? It's only illegal if it's an active crime scene.
Yeah. Okay. No, I was saying like after they were buried, because like I know you can't dig them up, but actually you can in most states like transport even to like a different cemetery, and so I guess because they bestow those rights onto the family to make those decisions.
Yes.
And so I guess it really isn't even the rights of the corpse per se. It's the rights of the family, and what they want to do. So I guess that kind of erases that line of rationale.
Yeah, and then and so just so you know, I believe when we die, we shouldn't have the rights to corpses like we give them. I mean, personally, I think we're wasting hundreds of organs that could go to people that need them and that will like die because they're on a waiting list for a heart. So I think it's I think if you're I think if you're not an organ donor, you're a little selfish. But I think we should be maybe not harvesting body parts off of dead bodies, but like we really need to start considering if these organs going to waste is actually a good thing. And I would say it's not.
Yeah. And a part of me is wondering if if the way that I'm placing moral consideration on a zygote, if that is rooted in my, I think I said this, like if it's rooted in my spirituality. And I think that is probably the answer. I would have to think more about it, just because like the more I think about it, because a lot of it is just like my belief set, right? Like, because I also think like a parent, I mean, because I think this obligation, this moral obligation from a parent to offspring is permanent. Personally. Like I think most parents would morally agree and understand, like most parents would say, like I would jump in front of a bus to save my kid, right? I mean that's a common like protective instinct of parents, but I would say that we are obligated as parents to do whatever it takes, including in extreme cases sacrificing ourselves to extend the lives of our children. I'm consistent with that across the board.
So I think the issue though when we come into like the argument on parental obligation is we have it's very hard to determine where that line is when it comes to parental obligation and who gets to determine that line. So for example, should you be obligated to give your heart to your child if it means you will die? Under the framework of parental obligation, my immediate thought would be yes, under that framework. Like, no matter what you have to do to save your child.
Whatever it takes.
But then that becomes a very sticky moral issue. Are you morally obligated to give your child their heart if it means you will die? I would argue you're not. And I think it then becomes even bigger if you have multiple children. So then it becomes which child deserves the obligation. Is it right to like, let's say you have 3 kids. Is it right under the parental obligation framework, if one of them it needs a heart and you're the only donor, you would have to give it to them. But then you are going to have 2 kids that don't have a parent anymore. So which obligation is more important? So I think that's why I can't really get behind parental obligation, because it leaves so many holes. And it's so flimsy. And I think no one I've ever talked to on the pro-life side has ever been able to ground parental obligation in like any way, shape, or form.
I would say and this is just like off the cuff, because I've never actually been pushed in that direction in terms of this, just like this line of thinking. But I would say that it always goes to the, and I would take the like utilitarian approach, reduce the suffering as much as possible, increase the amount of good that it can do. And so I would accredit that to the amount of potential of the child. And so in almost every case, that would be the youngest child. They have the most potential for the rest of their life. And so they would always, however, I mean, so it's like the oldest is born, they're it. Then the next one comes along, they're it. And so on and so forth, because they provide the most potential in terms of what they can do and experience with their life. And that's that just might be like a very personal individual belief of how I believe like the family, I mean and how important family is. Like I think having children is the greatest thing I can ever do to this earth.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think there's anything I can do on earth that is more valuable to people than reproducing.
What I would say in response to that is, if you take that same logic, I would say it tracks to almost always prioritize the pregnant person over the fetus, because
I agree.
And so then when we look at, I would say now we've run into the fact of like, okay, well, we should always be aborting, right? Because under this logic, we know that the person who's living already has been able to sustain their life. We don't know if the fetus can. So technically, the person that has the best chance is the person who's pregnant, because they've already proven that they can sustain it. So I think it's, if you walk that line, right, you walk it straight in. Honestly, you kind of walk it into antinatalism a little bit.
Yeah, and I can see how you could do that. And that's why I would argue on abortion, it's a you said earlier, like, up to the mother. I think the father's opinion of the pregnancy should matter, at least in some capacity, especially if they're married.
I think his input is important, right? I think he should absolutely have an opinion. I just don't think he should be the
final say.
The pregnant person has to be the final say. Otherwise, it's breaking what consent actually is, and that person who's convincing them, it would just be consent under duress.
Yeah, it's like I mean, if we compare it to like baseball terms, you don't play sports, but it's like tire goes to the runner. You may have heard that phrase before. Yeah. It's just like if man says yes but woman says no, tie goes to the runner. In this case, the runner is whoever's carrying the child. So if we figure out a way to scientifically make it so we can just like relocate the baby to the father, I mean, so be it. He can take over. But
I fully believe if we invented that, you would see if we invented that and said, okay, abortions are now,
the pro-life movement would end.
Yeah, I don't think it would end. I think you would see a lot of fathers who were very willing to say they would take care of the kid, but would not be willing to sustain the pregnancy.
Oh yeah, no, me and you will probably 100% agree on the hypocrisy of the Republican Party and conservatives as a whole. I mean, it's absurd, but it still poses a pretty good question of how much of a parental obligation is there? If there's none, there's none. If there is, there is. But I find that's where we find ourselves, where it's almost like we're heading into there's none territory.
I think if adoption is a thing, I think it's got to be none, right? Because like you're only legally obligated to make sure that the child gets some sort of care, but you as a parent are not obligated to parent that child, right? I would say the only way parental rights can exist is in a legal matter, because being a parent has nothing to do with biology. Being a parent is just who takes care of the kid.
It's like the guardian according to the law.
Yeah. I think that's really the only way you can look at parental obligation. So it has to be like consensual through legal matters. Otherwise, like, if that's the case, right? Then what if somebody gives their child up for adoption? Most pro-life people say your parental obligation is over. But what happens if that child needs a rare something and only the birth parent can provide it? Well, you've already given up that obligation. So why should you have to, like, you've already said, I don't want to be a parent. I gave the child up for adoption. And now does that parental obligation stay? I think it has to only be legally. I think any other aspect you do parental obligation, you run into way too many issues.
Yeah, and that brings up a valid point. And I guess it's hard to fit in what I believe ought to be into what is right now, because of how drastically different what I believe what ought to be is, right? I mean, because in my version of reality, and where this is where my approach is universal and everybody agrees, I would say that adoption would, like, putting babies up for adoption would not be necessary, because the father would always be around. I think because if there's an obligation, he is obligated to help, not only to support that child financially, but raise that child. And I think
then now not only are we forcing people to stay pregnant, we would be like you already said you don't want the government making decisions on a body, but you would be okay with the government making decisions on making people stay parents, because because then where do we go from there, right? Like, what if they're bad parents?
And I don't want to make it seem like I want the government to force this. This is and that's where it's hard when it comes to, because this is, at the end of the day, these are just like my opinions on the matter, because I would hope that the government wouldn't need to. Mm-hmm. It's like people would, like, the family unit and the negative stigma that is often surrounding, like, the family. Like, we always hear, like, what do they call it? The nuclear family. I don't really know what that means, but I hear it all the time on here. I'm assuming they just are referring to, like, the family unit.
Family unit's fine.
Yeah, and so it's like strengthening that family unit and increasing and decreasing how many babies are created outside of that family unit would benefit society in a way that the government wouldn't need to mandate these things, because all of these things would be how society is raising their children. We're raising their children to be like, hey, we're going to be in, like, the healthy family union. That's not even necessarily heterosexual. It can be any strong family unit, but having this sense of, like, responsibility for our family members.
Well, what I would say is the pro-choice stance is actually the one that's trying to strengthen that more, right? Because under a pro-life stance, we want unwanted children to be born, right? Under the pro-life stance, it doesn't matter whether that child is wanted or not. We just want the life born, and then what happens to the life after the birth there's really nothing. Like, it can go up for adoption. It can go into foster care. That's not strengthening anything. But what would strengthen it is only having children being born to wanted families. That would lower the rate of, like, domestic violence that children experience. It would lower the rate of child poverty. It would lower all of this, which would effectively strengthen the family unit.
See, and I agree. If that was the only existing reality of how our culture is changing, because our culture is definitely changing to be exactly that, but our culture is also promoting promiscuity.
So I don't necessarily have an issue with, when we can go down this route, obviously, because we're just having an open-ended conversation here. I don't necessarily, I see the idea behind promiscuity, like the idea behind it in general, as innately,
like, destigmatizing it to be some, like, sort of wrong, right? Is that the general
stigmatizing it? I think purity culture in and of itself is, like, inherently harmful and causes a lot of inherent misogyny, and I think it very much perpetrates R-word culture, even if you may not realize it and mean for it to. I think it's mere inception in what it promotes does, because an issue with purity culture, one of the biggest ones, is the people that are going to be the most pure are the people that are the most young. So there's an issue we run into where we have grown men fantasizing about sleeping with quote unquote virgins, and then at some point that person's going to be 18, 19 years old. And then you get into the infantilizing of people that purity culture kind of brings apart. And then you get people who start to infantilize even younger than that, because this idea of someone pure sort of warps their minds. The other issue that we have is that it really, my biggest issue with purity culture is it removes agency specifically from women. And we no longer view women as their own agent, their own person with their own rights and beliefs. We view them inherently by their sexuality. And that if they've had any sort of sex, we instantly start viewing them differently and knocking them down for what is a natural biological thing to have sex.
Yeah, and it is, like, I mean, it's funny because I've been having a lot of conversations with like LGBT individuals about sexuality, and I've reverted my stance and come to the conclusion or opinion that human beings. Now, I'd like to hear your thought on this. Human beings are born sexual, not heterosexual, not homosexual. They are born sexual. And
I'd be careful with that wording. Explain that a little bit, because that wording sends up red flags.
Yeah, they are born with the innate desire to have sexual intercourse.
I wouldn't say born. I'd say they mature for that desire. I wouldn't say born.
No. So I would say that they're born with an innate sexual desire that obviously human development and the development of your sexual organs and maturity plays into how you express that sexuality. I think we're all innately sexual, either asexual or bisexual or whatever it is, the sexuality where you're just fluid sexuality.
Okay, so just so I can understand, because I want to try to get this wording right. What you're saying is that as a species, when we are born, there's a component of our brain that will either grow into a sexual being, an asexual being, or something in between the two. But that portion of our brain is always there.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, it's like, and I wouldn't even know if it,
you gotta word it better.
The way I word it is probably poor. It's a fairly new,
very poor.
It's a very new like idea that I've been wrestling with, because it's like because then our expression of it, like I can express my sexuality with if I'm attracted to men homosexually. If I am attracted to women, I can express that sexuality through heterosexuality, right? And people can express their sexuality in many different ways as these topics are more openly discussed, right? We're learning about all different types of sexualities that people have, and
are you just trying to say that like you're born with whatever sexuality you're born with? Is that really, because that feels more like what you're trying to say is just you're born gay, you're born straight, you're born ace, you're born bisexual.
Well, I wouldn't. I don't know if I would agree that you're born homosexual. But I would say that you can be shaped by nature versus nurture, like by your surroundings, to adhere to that at a very young age. But I wouldn't.
I would like to push back on that. I think it's very clear with research that like nurture has no effect on human sexuality, right? If that were the case, no gay person would be born to conservative parents. It just wouldn't happen, right? I think it's very clear that we are born a very specific, with a very specific, like, not to repeat what you said, but our sexuality is basically already entrenched in our DNA when we're born. So it's already written. The code is written. It's just at what time the code will start expressing itself.
Is there like a scientific metric that people have discovered of like of differences between like the homosexual brain and a heterosexual brain?
So I haven't looked directly into the homosexual versus heterosexual brain, but we have seen it in the transgender brain. So for instance, we've done brain scans.
I've seen those studies.
Yeah, so we know that people, at least when it comes to their gender expression, that is 100%.
That's like gender dysphoria is caused by that. It's like a chemical. It's like a mixture of chemical and physical changes, like in the way that their brain is compared to what a trans woman, the way that a male's brain is traditionally. They have more characteristics that would be associated with the female sex.
Yes, but this is different than gender dysphoria. So to correct you on this. So okay, gender dysphoria, and I'm not trans, so if I say anything wrong, my trans friends are all watching. They will absolutely correct me on some stuff. But gender dysphoria can not only can affect trans people, and gender dysphoria is not, let me rephrase this. Here's how I want to say it. Not all transgender people have gender dysphoria. They don't have it, right?
Okay.
So gender
It's not like a
dysphoria is very
requirement.
specific. Correct. Gender dysphoria means that they have this innate discomfort. Actually, let me pull up the actual definition because I don't want to say incorrect
Yeah,
things.
I think I know that distinction that you're making.
Yes, it's like an unease that their biological sex and their gender identity mismatch. Like they don't connect. But there are trans people, right, who don't mind having, like, a trans woman who doesn't care that she has
aspect.
a bling bling. And it's a specific disorder that is corrected and not corrected, but treated with gender reassignment surgery, right? Like that's how you would treat gender dysphoria. But when I'm talking about like the similarities between the trans brain and the cisgender brain, so there was a study where they took cisgendered men and cisgendered women and had them both look at corn, and see the parts of the brain that light up. Now, cisgendered men, when we view corn, like sexually active ones, our brains light up a very specific way, and it tends to light up more than cisgendered women's brains do when looking at that same corn. Well, not same corn, but like
I've seen these studies.
And when they took a transgender woman, who a lot of people would say, well, no, a transgender woman, bigots would say that's just a man, right? When we see a transgender woman view that same thing, their brains light up more similarly to their cisgender woman counterparts and not their cisgendered male counterparts. So if it was going to be a thing where we say trans women are not true women, their brain would have to light up more similar to that brain of a cisgender man, but it doesn't.
Yeah. Yeah, it's the way that scientists have been able to identify like sex characteristics of the brain, and like the study that I read talked about how transgender women, their like sex characteristics on the scale that the scientists like measure it is very much on the side of like a cisgendered male or cisgendered woman compared to man. Sorry, I get so backwards sometimes when a trans woman would line up as a cisgendered woman more so than she would a cisgendered man. Sorry, I get tied up.
It's okay, you're still new.
Yes, very, very. And luckily, I've met a couple people within the LGBT community that have been very gracious with trying to help me come to understanding it a little bit better. And so to loop this back around, because you started to talk about purity culture, and I would say that the way that purity culture is done is wrong. It doesn't work. It's very clear that it leads to more problematic things. But I would argue that purity culture, it was not teaching young men and women to control their sexual urges or desires. I think it was teaching men and women how to shove down their sexual desires and to put like masks and layers over their sexual desires. And then what happens is the farther you push it down and the more things you stack on top of it, the bigger the explosion when it finally does come.
So then you would be more. So I would say you're less interested in purity culture, and it sounds like you're more interested in like comprehensive sexual education, where we're teaching young people. Like,
I differ from conservatives heavily on that.
Beautiful,
on that topic. I even looked up the national sex education and like how they broke it down by grade, and like talking from like the fundamentals in kindergarten, like talking about like knowing what bodily autonomy is, right? Like knowing like you're your own person, and then as they get older and more mature, the topics get more mature and more diverse.
So David, what specifically are you conservative about? You agree with me a lot more on the pro-choice stuff than you think. You agree with the idea of comprehensive sex education. You agree on gender identities. What aspect of conservatism, whatever the word is, what aspects of that align with you? Because you're aligning so much heavily with the left when it comes to social policies.
I am, and I wouldn't say that I'm aligning, more so just understanding, because I don't agree that homosexuality is a healthy way of life. And personally, And that's just my belief, but I don't want to project that belief onto anybody else.
I respect
and that's
you for
why
not projecting that belief. That's a very problematic belief, and I would like to know like why. I mean, I obviously I know that like you have a very extensive religious background, but I would like to know like what about your religion specifically, because I hope I think you said you're Christian, right?
Yeah.
I would hope that like we can agree that when we look at literal translations, homosexual is like nowhere in that book, right? When we look at the literal translations, and it didn't really start cropping up until like the 1930s.
Yeah, homosexuality as a identity, as a form of like expression in society was not a thing. It was not talked about at all in the Bible. It's like being a homosexual. Like people have explained to me that somebody can be a homosexual and never have homosexual intercourse, and that doesn't change their mind and their belief and their understanding of themselves in their idea that they are homosexual. And so the Bible doesn't talk about that at all. It only talks about sexual intercourse. And it does say that homosexual intercourse is wrong, but it also says any intercourse outside of marriage is wrong. And so and that's where I align myself as well.
But so I ask because this section of the Bible, if I'm not mistaken, is Old Testament, right? Like it doesn't really come up in New Testament as much, if I'm
Very
remembering
little.
correctly. But there are a lot of Old Testament aspects of the Bible that we all break on a daily basis. But we're never as stringent on that. We're always stringent on, I believe being gay is wrong, and that's the thing in the Bible we should keep, and not. And listen, at the time,
the most
Bible,
Christians do that. I agree. I don't do that personally. Most Christians,
I get that you absolutely do not want to push your beliefs on other people, but I think it's important to like when you have like beliefs like this that I would say are a little bit problematic, we sort of analyze them and see if there's any deeper meaning or any way that we can like come to resolve there. I would say at the time the Bible was written, it makes sense that in the Bible they would harp on homosexuality and gay sex because, and if I'm wrong about the
most of the
history
time
here,
it was essay.
Yeah, but
it was almost always essay.
But another thing was the dislike of the Romans. So another aspect of it came into because if you look at the story, if you look at the Bible, and then you can really pinpoint certain groups of people that the Bible was trying to be written to weed out in the time that it was written. So, like for example, the Romans were very sexually fluid. Like very.
Well, that's
like
New Testament. Old Testament, it would be more the Egyptians, and the Egyptians were very heavily.
The ancient Egyptians was a very long empire. So like the Romans cropped up.
The earliest form of Egypt, when like in the Old Testament, in the verses that we're discussing, it's when Egypt had like dominion and enslaved the Israelites, the Jewish people, and so that's where. But I'm agreeing with you. I mean, a lot of Christians do pick and choose which ones they want to harp on, which ones they don't. I view them all the same. Now, just because I don't believe that it's the healthiest lifestyle, does that mean that it's the wrong lifestyle for you? No.
So what about it? What about it is unhealthy specifically?
Because I believe that the most healthy lifestyle that we can choose is one that is chasing after Jesus's representation of life.
Okay, so you're talking about health in like a spirituality aspect.
Exactly. Yeah. Okay. Exactly. And that's from my personal experience. That's been where I've been able to find the most happiness, the most confidence, and the most security in my not only my identity, but just in how I am to interact with the world. And so I would hold somebody who is a homosexual and how I don't think that is a healthy lifestyle in the same light as somebody who eats McDonald's 3 times a day and is a glutton and doesn't live a very healthy lifestyle. I would hold them
with that one.
I used to be a big fan of McDonald's, not so much anymore, but I would hold both of those like equally in terms of unhealth. I'm like, that is just not the healthiest way that we could live our lives as humans.
Do you not think it's more unhealthy to repress that stuff? I would say it's actually way more unhealthy like repression would be, right? Because not only then are you going to face actual damage and like psychological damage and stuff like that, things that are going to harm you while you're here. Because we're not going to agree on like an afterlife, or like I don't believe anything happens when you die. You believe in an afterlife. So obviously there's really no place we can come to terms in when we die. But like
you'd be surprised about my belief about the afterlife.
Interesting. Well,
yeah, that goes into a much more philosophical conversation about time. We can touch on it later, but I want to respond to you here. It's and all of this stems from my belief that aligning ourselves with Jesus, he can heal certain aspects of our heart that don't align with him. And he is the purest way to a fulfilled and happy life. And that is just in my experience, that's been the reality for me. And I've tried a lot. I did drugs for a long time. I had a bunch of sex for a long time. I engaged in all sorts of nefarious activities and trying to find fulfillment and satisfaction in whatever I could. But I felt like no matter where I looked, I was always left unsatisfied and wanting more. And then I found Jesus, and I didn't have to look any further. I felt completely and wholly satisfied with who I am and what I am supposed to do on this earth.
But how can you know that that experience would be universal?
Because I believe that Jesus didn't just do those things for me. I believe he did them for everybody, including those who don't even believe that he existed.
Now, we can get into a metaphysics debate if you want.
And the reality is none of my beliefs matter to you. At the end of the day, none of those beliefs are relevant at all, because Jesus never told Christians to go and force our way of life onto people. Never. He said, we are not to conform to the patterns of this world, meaning whatever the patterns are, we are to not conform to them, but we are also not to try and force our way of life onto them either. We're supposed to go into those communities, into the places where there is disconformity, and bring Jesus to those things. And in my belief, that was love, that was acceptance, that was empathy, all the things that are not generally ascribed to Christians and conservatives nowadays. And so it's very, and that's why it's hard for me. I don't like to say I'm a Republican very often, because I find myself. Whole
lives. Is it not you that does those lives, debate a reasonable Republican? Isn't that you?
No, I say open-minded conservative.
Oh, okay, I just had it backwards. Got it.
Yeah. And so it's like, and I voted Republican, and I voted Democrat, sparingly. I actually haven't voted a lot, in my 12 years of being a voting age, but it's hard because I don't align with the Republican Party, and I also don't align with the Democrat Party in the way that they're going about it as well. And so I consider myself conservative because of my conservative beliefs about how the world should be, how the world ought to be. And that's why I advocate for what I believe to be the most beneficial to society if adhered to. And I'll fight for those things to exist, right?
So I'm just really interested. Like, if you were to have to say, how do I want to phrase this? If you were to give 3 tenets of conservatism, like 3 tenets that really for you go, this is what conservatism is to me, and this is why I'm conservative, what would they be?
A restricted morality like standard, or a clear morality standard. Not restricted might not be the best term, just like a clear and concise standard of morality. And then what makes that conservative would be the belief that is the only way.
Okay.
to achieve the level of like the world that I hope to see. A second tenet would be like fiscally conservative. So in terms of like economics, it'd be more of a less government owned businesses, more privately owned businesses.
Okay.
And then on the flip side, or not really on the flip side, but also as a tenet of conservatism would be conserving what we have. And that includes being heavily regulating who gets to come and experience what we have. And so that would involve immigration policies. It would also involve like property protection rights and those types of things. And I generally align more conservatively in those areas.
All right. Well, for the last hour here, I would love to touch on these three things a little bit.
Okay.
Because I actually think it's not the conservative party that's the party of the conservatives that's doing what these things. I actually believe it's the party of the liberals and progressives that are doing these a little more. So
yeah, for sure. I mean, in modern day, that's why I think I told you earlier. I've always considered myself middle-leaning left.
Well, I don't even mean just that.
I
I would mean that like the idea of conservatism doesn't line up with these tenets necessarily.
Oh, okay.
So like for one clear morality standard, I just don't believe that has anything to do with like conservatism or liberalism. I think that's just individual by individual. And I think there's a lot of conservatives that have a morality standard that you would probably disagree with, but that they believe is heavily conservative. So a big thing with conservatism is like maintaining tradition. And like, if we were to propose real conservatism, what part of American tradition are we trying to go back to? And the second you go back further than 20 years, you have an immoral system that's perpetrating human rights violations, right? So like, I don't know how well a clear morality standard works, especially when like not everyone shares the same faith and things like that. I would say fiscally conservative. I actually disagree that that's the right way to run the country. Just in general, I actually think that, well, right, you said less government-owned businesses and more private-owned businesses. I think we have the most private businesses in the world. Like when we look at like what I actually think is we need to regulate private businesses a bit more. Because in periods of low regulation, like such as like when we look at like the meat packing industry in like the 1920s, in times of very low regulation, we saw massive cuts to product. We saw massive terrible working conditions. We were effectively poisoning the American people. It wasn't until the government got involved with the FDA, and now we can talk about the efficacy and how they run currently, but it wasn't until they got involved that we saw the meatpacking industry stop poisoning the American citizens, right? And I think we're even seeing that now when we look at like companies like Amazon, where people are peeing in bottles instead of going to the bathroom because they know the second they go to the bathroom, their job is on the line because they won't be able to keep up with the workload, and then they're going to get fired. Like I think we see too many times we see the profit over people mindset when it comes to conservatism. And I think the way to get around that is actually a bit more governmental restrictions, or maybe even not restrictions, but like more things like OSHA, more things like that, things that are designed to protect the labor force.
Yeah, and sure, I could probably concede that certain industries, if not like across the board, there can be more regulations to help make sure that that people aren't exploiting the system, and I think that's perfectly reasonable. But it's hard to look at the left and the rhetoric that's used when it comes, because so often I hear like they want everything to be publicly owned, like they want the workers to own the means of production, right? It's
but I don't know. I feel like you might have a misunderstanding on what that would look like in our society. Right? So when we talk about the workers owning the means of production, really what that boils down to is giving them a seat and giving them a level of control so that the people that are actually making the product are kind of dictating how that product goes. Now, like realistically, the way that I view it as working is that like there should always be a worker board representative on any board of a major company who has substantial voting power, right? So that way companies can't decide on a whim, we're going to cut back the workforce to save a couple dollars. You actually have somebody who's fight. I mean, and this is what unions do, right? This is like what it would just, we would be cutting out the middleman of the union and we would letting the workers do it themselves. But they would be at these meetings going, hey, how about instead of cutting all the pay for these people, we cut a little bit of pay from the people at the top, right? And I think that would be because I mean, practically I'm not communist, but like ideologically I'm a communist. Like I'm full red.
I see that a lot actually.
But in our society right now, I would say that giving the workers a seat at the table would do nothing but benefit. One of the beautiful examples that I saw was someone said, imagine you have a factory. Now this factory makes whatever, they make baby bottles, and they do it in like small town Iowa. They make baby bottles, and right now the margins are like, it's like $5 to produce and $10 to sell. So they're making about 50% margins, which isn't terrible, and they're able to run and sustain, and this factory does a lot for the community. All the parents work there. They have softball teams. They help out. Now, in comes big businessman who bought the factory. Now, in our current model, big businessman can go, well, it would be cheaper. I could make these for $2 in China and increase my profit margins by another 25%. So he goes, I'm going to go to China and make these for $2. Sorry, you all just lost your job. Even though we were profitable before, I'm going to go and make us more profitable. Now, if the workers own a seat at the table, they can say, no, we are keeping production here. Everyone's still eating. It's just you can't try to capitalize off of exploited labor.
Yeah, and I would agree that companies shouldn't be allowed to exploit, like if they have a manufacturer in another company, that manufacturer needs to abide by our laws in terms of labor, like child labor and things like that. I would agree that that is a huge problem within our businesses, right? Especially the larger they get. But it's still hard for me to get behind the idea behind that, because you want to give the workers equitable authority over the company when they didn't input any of the risk in buying the company. Like as that, like in your example, that guy comes in with all of his money, buys the company. He is inputting a large amount of risk into that, because what if?
Well, the bank is like, let's be honest, most of these people buy these companies with like bank loans, but yeah.
So and that's. And I don't know how I feel about the banks, to be honest. But like loans and stuff like that, when it comes to these types of business, I don't know if somebody should be allowed to go and take a loan out to go and buy somebody else's business. I feel like that is just.
Do you think it's okay that someone buys a business for the sheer purpose of shifting it somewhere else to make more money, as opposed to the people that have built this business up, letting them receive a piece of the pie?
Yeah. Because even though they've helped build the business up, they didn't put in any of the risk to get it started. The business wouldn't exist without somebody else first putting forth all of the financial risk to start it. And then that person provided them with the opportunity to help build it up.
But they are providing all the labor, right? Like Amazon would effectively be done if no one decided to work for them, right? It doesn't matter how innovative Jeff Bezos is. If nobody will do the work because he's refusing to give them proper working conditions, he's not going to make any money. He's only making money off the backs of other people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but it's a mutual relationship. He owns the he applies all the risk, or he takes on all the risk. He puts forth the means to get for all these workers to work, and then those workers then come in knowing that he took in all the risk, and he built the place for them to work, and all the systems that they will begin to operate within, and then they go and then begin to operate within those, and then as the company grows, obviously their roles may expand, their roles may change, but they still never, like, the business would have never existed if they didn't. The business would have existed even if they didn't, because somebody else would have come and done the work.
But hold on. So I think they took the risk thing is not entirely accurate, right? So like, let's say I am running a cookie stand. I'm selling cookies on the side of the road, and I'm by myself. I can only sell 10 cookies an hour, right? Now I realize that if I hire somebody to help me, we could sell 20 cookies an hour. But by paying them the same thing that I'm getting paid, when we're both doing the same work, I'm not going to make any profit off of hiring them. So the only way that I can profit off of hiring them is if I hire them for cheaper than what the labor is actually worth. And then I take the remainder of that profit that they should have, right? So that's my big issue when we look at like capitalism, right? So, and this is a very like dumbed down explanation, obviously. But so if I'm selling 10 cookies an hour and each cookie's $5, I make $50 an hour, I keep that whole profit. If I can sell 20 cookies an hour, that's $100 an hour. If I just split that with the other person who's doing the exact same work, I don't make any more profit. So instead I say, well, you can have $25 an hour and then I get 75, even though we're both doing the exact same amount of work.
But was this other person required to bring their own cookies?
No, they're selling they're selling my cookies, but they're doing all the same work that I'm doing.
Like I would question as if that's what's happening, or is if I was the first cookie stand, and I sold 10 cookies an hour for 10 cookies a day for $1 each, and I made $10, and I was like, you know what, I want to make more money, so I go and have my friend also sell 10 cookies for $2, and then they keep the $10. And then I keep the excess $10 that they made. And now I've made more money. He was still adequately paid based off of what I was already earning. And now I'm taking an additional profit because I'm making them charge more, which is how most businesses operate.
But I would then argue that now we get into the issue of capitalism, the second issue of capitalism, where they're effectively scamming the consumer. You're overinflating the price of your cookies now so you can generate profit. You are now saying, I'm not going to screw over my employee. They can have the exact same money as me. I'm just going to screw over the consumer, which I think is equally wrong.
And that's, I would say that if it's a private company, they can charge whatever they want for whatever they have. Now, obviously, if there are things that are deemed essential for society, those prices should be regulated. But in terms of general business, if I want to start putting together flower bouquets and growing a garden in my backyard with all large variety of flowers, and I want to sell those bouquets for $100, even though it cost me 50 cents to plant those flowers, who's to say I'm wrong for that?
What would you say in that regard then to people that buy up houses to rent them out at higher rates?
I think that's wrong.
But it's the same concept. It's the same principle. I own a resource. I'm selling you that resource. Under capitalism, I get to dictate the price of said resource. So why is this now different than before?
Because I would argue that a home would be something that is essential.
So you think that free market capitalism is okay, but we would have to subjugate food, water, and shelter away from that, and those things should be regulated at certain costs. So so you wouldn't be in favor of a full free market. You think that there are things that should be regulated.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's definitely it is necessary for socialistic programs to exist, right?
And how far would you go on that? So like, I would say that in modern technology, Wi-Fi is essential. Would you say that Wi-Fi should also be regulated at a certain price? It kind of already is, but like,
Yeah, and I wouldn't. That I think my opinion is because I think the internet's destroyed society. It's one of
I would disagree.
one of the leading things that's been dismantling like society's cohesiveness.
I fully disagree, but we can save that debate for another day because we'll
Yeah.
be here for 30 hours. What about like
to
clothing?
your point, without deflecting, I would say that the internet is something that should be regulated, especially now because it's required for most jobs.
Okay.
Yeah.
Like, and so I'm just seeing how far we take that. So what about like clothing as well? Do you think clothing should be something that's regulated since, you know, we need clothes?
No, because I think there's already a extreme diversity in terms of how expensive clothes are. I mean, you can go and get clothes for $1 a t-shirt, right? And then you can go get clothes for $10,000 a t-shirt. And there's already a huge spectrum available for that. So I don't think there's really any need to regulate it.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so right now, the massive amounts of inflation on like groceries and stuff, you would say the government should step in and say you can't charge more than A, B, or C for a box of cereal. So that way these companies can't raise the price of their goods.
If it's and this is where it's unique, because if it's processed, I think it should be regulated. But if it's not processed, then I don't think it should. Like if somebody is growing vegetables and then they go and sell those vegetables, I think they should be able to sell those for however much they want.
But wait, shouldn't it be the exact opposite? If we want to promote like healthier lifestyles, right? Because this is kind of what we're doing now. So I don't know if you know about grain subsidies. So right now, the U.S. government subsidizes farmers very heavily for grain. And there's a reason why they do. It's because the grocery industry is very intent on keeping like snack food and junk food a thing, right? So they lobby the government.
And the war in Ukraine has heavily affected grain.
Yeah, but this was even before that.
Export.
This was
really?
This
okay.
was, yeah, the grain subsidies have been for a while. The commercial grocery industry lobbies the government so that way they will subsidize grain farmers because they want more grain to make more bad food. And what doesn't get subsidized is the healthy food that would actually make the society like healthier and life expectancy raise and things like that. You then get into things like food deserts where the government I won't say the government, where you have people who can only have access to those foods that have been subsidized by grain subsidies. They don't have access to get healthy food, and it would cost them more to get it. So if we want to promote more of a healthy lifestyle and promote this stuff a little more, we subsidize the healthy food and we don't subsidize the unhealthy food?
I can see what you're saying. It's hard to apply that in this scenario because the way that, I mean, capitalism perpetuates obesity. Capitalism feeds off of people's desire to eat more. And higher quantities of especially processed foods with all sorts of garbage in them. And so I feel like the regulation of these processed foods has contributed to the problem because they've been more mass produced, because they've been more readily available in excess. That's contributed to the health problem. While I would say that just if we could eliminate processed foods almost altogether and just revert to natural foods, if health is what we're aspiring, we should just eliminate processed foods altogether. And then this conversation is moot and void, right? And then we can just subsidize.
I worry how much eliminating a food source from people brushes up against your mindset of conservatism. Right? Because one of the key tenets of conservatism is less big government. And I would say the government telling us what foods we can and can't eat is one of the biggest biggest governments you can have.
Yeah, and that's where it's hard for what ought to be because what ought to be is an anarcho-communist state. That's what ought to be. I mean, in its purest, most simple form.
Anarcho-communist?
Yes.
Interesting.
It's basically like a utopia where everybody works equally, everybody receives equally, and there's no corruption or interference. It's just a cohesive society that all contributes and takes equally, right? At least that's how it's been explained to me to understand it. I could, if I'm off, you can clarify.
I think you're just talking about standard communism, but I have to look into like anarcho-communism. But I think you're mostly talking about just standard communism.
Yeah, it's more along the lines of eliminating government completely. Like communism.
Yeah, no, I'm in favor of no state. I definitely am in favor of eliminating the state.
Okay, yeah. So anarcho-communism would be like eliminating everything, federal and state. Like we're no longer, like, borders don't exist, countries don't exist. We're just the world, and humanity all lives cohesively. That would be like an anarcho-communist utopia, is how I describe it, because it's not practical.
Yes. Yeah.
And so
yeah. No,
yeah,
you're right. I'm looking at
think
anarcho-communism now. You're right. Yes.
And I think you and I would probably agree, like, because you said like you're not a communist in practicality, but you are in like ideology. It's like
Yes.
we're probably actually pretty similar. It's like in a perfect world, I absolutely think that's what ought to be, but what is and what's practical right now, I don't think it's practical to go to change the way that all of that runs for that very reason. Because we would have to eliminate processing foods, and we'd have to eliminate all of these programs that are so heavily intertwined with our society.
But how can you ideologically be in favor of an anarcho-communist system where we remove the state, but be in favor of regulating who gets to cross our border?
Because an anarcho-communist state it infers that there's no evil, there's no malice, there's no crime, there isn't any outlying factors. Because we don't live in that world, and because people are inherently selfish and they're looking out for their own best interests, people come here with ill intent, and people live here with ill intent. I mean, it's the nature of human beings, and therefore it's to have a system like that. I feel like is a slippery slope to people, to even more of a select few elite controlling everything. Because in a system like that, the most powerful people are going to be the people in charge of the government, and I don't think that the government should have more power than the people.
I slightly disagree. Kiara finally showed up, so I'm gonna let in Kiara just because she was in the initial.
Yeah.
Hey,
Kiara, turn your camera on. We're doing cameras.
No.
Yes, bestie.
Okay, give me 1 second though. Can I just say something really quick though?
Yeah.
Okay, because I do actually disagree with the fact that people are inherently selfish, because we've seen it like time and time again that we're not. Like otherwise we wouldn't like coexist. Like we always had to rely on each other. And I think it's like more circumstantial, like why we are selfish. I think that the society that we're currently living in is making us selfish rather than it being inherent to our nature.
And that could be the case. I just think it's the transition into a state like that, or into a society like that, would be detrimental not only to people but to the world. I just don't think
I think
it's
like
tangible.
if we did a quick transition, Kiara, I can't.
A quick transition. That's awesome. A quick transition would be even harder, because then the people that are so far stuck in their ideology of what they believe, and mostly like right-wing extremism, right? We can all agree that it exists. To stop that abruptly would almost certainly result in physical conflict, and if historically the places that have tried to do this have genocided that opposition. And so therefore, I think it's just practically unreasonable to think that America, in all of our greatness, quote unquote, would be able to do it any differently, especially suddenly. I think maybe gradually over hundreds of years, it might be something that we can progress into, but that there would be so much more into making that transition than simply just, hey, we're just gonna do it as fast as we can. I just think it's historically proven to be dangerous, and just with the current political climate, I fear of violence in America's future in the next 10 years.
But we don't have to. We don't. I don't know. I don't think we're ever gonna hit a point where we're at another like civil war. I think I don't see that happening. Even though I think that's what the like grander political theater would want you to believe. My whole issue is it just seems like every take you have is so at odds with what conservatism is.
Mm-hmm. And it's mostly, to be honest, in opposition of that quick transition. If I'm being completely honest, it's because I am fearful of that transition happening and causing millions of people to be, who knows, right?
So my only question is, why not just say you're a centrist or a moderate? Why even label yourself conservative when it doesn't seem to be what you are at all?
And that very well could be the case. I'd have to really think. I consider myself a conservative because before, just like 3 months ago, I would have yelled at me for saying these things and called myself an idiot, right? Like I would have just been like, you are out of your damn mind. But as I've been just trying to understand and learn more about society and people, I feel like I've drifted away from the traditional conservative stance, but I do think that the conservative stance with major adjustments is the better approach because
it's so funny though, because I'm entirely the opposite. So if I look at how things were, right, and if there's like anything valuable to it, then I would have to like assess if we should continue doing so. And I think if we keep going on where we're going, like clearly something's wrong, right? I do think we need to progress. That's why I'm mostly progressive, because I know that the current standard is not sufficient to ensure like an overall sense of well-being for the society that we're participating and operating in. And I think it would be like within our best interest to apply certain standards that move us to a direction that is like this utopian idea that everybody's constantly talking about. Like, yeah, sure, it is in some way, because people are incapable of thinking the in-between steps. And that's why I like Javon so much too, because when he talks about abolition of prison and police, it's not something that's going to happen tomorrow. And we are grounded enough to understand that. But going backwards seems to not work, because why did they progress to begin with if things were so great back then? And if you look at the policies as well, it seems to be that it usually resulted in the marginalization and oppression of groups, and it also had like some form of negative impact of the economy or the individual.
Yeah, and I could say that progress is not inherently good, though, right?
Depends on how you progress, of course.
Yeah, and I would argue that there are a lot of ways where we are progressing as a society where if it keeps going, it can become harmful.
Like what?
Even just dismantling traditional gender roles.
Why is that harmful? I actually see absolutely no utility making a prescriptive claim of assigning like any sort of role to a gender without giving like more the societal value of those roles being fulfilled regardless of the gender. It's not saying
So
get rid of the roles, period. It's more like let's not have a prescription or any form of sense of value system that determines like an individual's value based on if they can align with the gender that they are and then fulfill the roles that they can fulfill, rather than just looking to fulfill the things that they're capable and strong in doing so. So that I see no sense in that whatsoever.
yeah, and I'm not saying by reaffirming traditional gender roles in the sense where we're shaming anybody that doesn't fall into those, but I think that that's not what we're doing. We're not just trying to. It doesn't, at least doesn't feel like we're trying to uh, normalize men and women not in their traditional gender roles. I feel like it feels like we're trying to destroy gender roles completely and making it whatever we want. It's just
I
gender
disagree.
fluid in terms of roles.
I disagree because roles are still expected, right? Like if you're a parent, you're still expected, like with your co-parent, to fulfill certain roles. But instead of looking in, oh, the woman must be the one that nurtures, even though maybe she doesn't have the capability of doing so. Like I think my grandparents are a great example. My grandma was a businesswoman, okay? She could sell shoes like nobody else could. And
Yeah, my mom's a lawyer.
Right, and my grandpa was more the nurturing person, and my dad and my aunt always told me he was the one that came to the bedside when they had a bad dream, and he fulfilled that role perfectly. And they gave the children what they needed, but it didn't correlate with the societal expectation. And I think feminist theory is often misconstrued where they say, well, you're against the traditional roles. No, I think if a family decides that their perfect family structure happens to be what are the traditional gender roles, I encourage them in doing so. I encourage them full-heartedly if a mom wants to stay at home and do that. Like I highly encourage them to do so. But I also want to analyze and criticize the structures that have forced them into place and maybe put any sort of disadvantage onto them. But it doesn't mean that I don't believe in self-actualization.
Well, sure. I hear what you're saying, and that even, but that is contradictory to a lot of the language out there from the feminist movement. I mean, misandry is very real.
How real is it?
And very
What effect?
evident.
What? Okay, so David, can you tell me an instance, right, where misandry has affected men, like at any sort of data or any sort of measurement where we could see the potential harm that has stemmed from misandry? Because I can give you so many instances where misogyny hasn't only hurt people, but actually unalived people. And I think when we equate misandry, which inherently stems from misogyny, it's a response to it. Misandry didn't exist prior to misogyny. It correlates to it. So please, I want to see how it would apply to society when we talk about misandry.
Because there are cases where of domestic violence against men. That's not a something that doesn't happen.
What do you think okay, when we talk about then toxic masculinity, right? Like we could see how their worth and their value within society was always defined by their physical dominance and assertion of aggression and violence. How would that apply to women? Like what kind of standard has been set that expects women to be physically violent?
Nothing, but that doesn't have to do with the hating of men. That's what misandry is.
No,
it's just hating men.
No, it's hate of the results of what men do within society.
Oh, well,
it's not the man itself, right? It's you can't look at it as like the individual man that misandrists hate. It is more like the result of what male dominance has
they hate
created.
Masculinity.
Not necessarily
masculinity.
toxic masculinity, not masculinity. Masculinity is not inherently bad. But toxic masculinity has put them into positions of oppression, have put them into situations of them having social barriers, and now we even look at legal barriers where women are disproportionately affected by the overturning of Roe v. Wade. So that is what we're hating. We're hating the system, and I'm saying we. I'm not necessarily a misandrist, but I can sympathize with the notion. Whereas, like, men hating women or finding them inferior doesn't have any grounds or any reasoning.
Well, sure. It's because toxic masculinity, as it's described, is absolutely necessary in society.
Why?
Because men are inherently, traditionally, more competent at violence.
Hold on. I would hate to interrupt right now, but I have to go because I have my chicken in the oven. So I'm gonna let Siobhan take over, and it was
okay, cute.
Dang.
no worries. I would say you hold the same position as her. Like you disagree with
I would disagree because like the tenets of like what are the key characteristics of toxic masculinity are all dangerous and detrimental to society.
Yeah, well, there are tenets that of like aggression, right? Would that be a toxic trait of toxic masculinity?
I would say aggression is toxic, strength is not.
Okay, see, I would say that aggression is necessary.
I would disagree.
For people within our society. Well, and like people in the military, people in the police, fire department, those types of roles, which are they're traditionally male dominated. It's not saying that women are incapable of doing them, but generally, men are more competent at violence. Therefore, when in industries that directly combat violence, men are gonna generally be more competent at those jobs because we're inherently physically stronger naturally and are more impulsive. So in the face of immediate danger where a decision has to be made on an instant with no regard to any feelings whatsoever, men are generally more capable of doing so.
I would disagree because women are more logical than men. So sure. I think the issue is men are too impulsive and we don't make logical decisions often, whereas women are traditionally more logical than men are. So they're able to make, so like we'll take firefighters, for example. A firefighter just deciding to run into a building is probably not the smart idea, but one that can stop and take a second and analyze their surroundings and then decide what to do is more important. But the latter is not aggression, whereas the first one would be a form of aggression.
See, but I would say that if there was a child in that burning building and you could see that child and there was a gulf of flames in between you and that child, I mean, that child's life could end in seconds. We do not know what's going to happen.
Sure, but what if the floor underneath the child is not safe for a grown person to stand on? So by rushing into that, you are now going to put you and the child's life at risk. Right? This is the issue with aggression. Like aggression presupposes that there are no what ifs, but there are always what ifs.
Of course. Yeah, but I would say that the consequence of waiting far outweighs the risk of acting immediately. Because the consequence of waiting is you may wait and come up with a good plan, but then that floor caves in and that child is unalive. Or you can impulsively act, run in there, and maybe get him out of the way before that floor collapses. I mean, and all of it is a what if scenario, and there are unfortunately times when there is no time to think, there is only time to act, and therefore the logical thinking does not help in that situation, and that's why people in those fields are so heavily trained so they can see situations and very quickly react appropriately because it's almost like muscle memory. They've seen this scenario so many times in their training that they now just know immediately, like it just needs to happen. And do I think that women are incapable of receiving that same training? No, absolutely. I think women are more than capable of getting that same training and being just as effective. But I think in general, men are going to be more competent in those positions. Just traditional. Like, I mean, we're talking in the majority of men versus the majority of women.
But then that's not the reason they're rushing in is not an inherent level of aggression. They're rushing in because they've been trained to rush in. So I would disagree. I would then say that that's not like aggression. If you're saying women can learn to rush in too, it's not something that's inherent to like the aggressive nature. It's inherent to how you were trained.
When I view aggressive, I view it as like action without any like acknowledgement of emotion. Like to be like aggressive, you are like pursuing something with no regard to emotions, and I just think in general, if we're talking like the worst of the worst scenarios, men are going to be able to respond with less emotion quickly than women will.
I wouldn't say that that's necessarily aggression. I mean, I guess if you're saying like the aspect of the definition that's like readiness to attack or confront, sure.
Yeah.
But like aggression tends to denote some subset of violent behavior.
Yeah. And that's where the toxic aspect, I mean, the more toxic aspect comes in, right? And there's absolutely no place for like unnecessary violence or unnecessary aggression of any kind. And sure, the way that masculinity is being perpetuated definitely contributes to that. And I think we would both agree. I think you had on your page like men and toxic masculinity affects men, is a problem for both men and women. So I think
yes.
A lot of women also perpetuate these qualities as well. But
well, I would disagree with that. I think that it's just because toxic masculinity is used to hurt women from the men's side. What about like Stoicism? Because Stoicism is a pretty big tenet of masculinity. Would you
is
think
that like to be stoic, like to not show emotion, to be like melancholy, like in your emotional stability, I guess?
Yeah, that and like the idea that like men should suffer in silence, basically.
Oh yeah, I had a great conversation about this the other night. And I think that the way that masculinity is taught, it's very similar to like that purity culture, what we were talking about earlier. It's not controlling emotions, it's suppressing them. And I think a lot of masculinity in the way that it's taught, especially in American culture, it's to suppress emotions. It's not to control them, it's to suppress them. Like when I like to compartmentalize my emotions, where if I have an emotional response to something, but it's not appropriate for me to express that emotional response in that moment, I kind of like put it on a shelf for later. I'm going to shelve that. I'll deal with that later, but right now I can't deal with it because I've got a task to accomplish or achieve. And I think that's very different than if I were to have an emotional response and then just suppress it. Because then when you suppress it, then the next time something happens in an emotional response, if I haven't dealt with that yet, now I'm layering it on top. And I build layers, and that's what leads to people exploding with emotions and having extreme lashing out, especially with men, because men are more prone to violence just because anger is a driving emotion of our of us.
Yeah, so what I would say is that it should actually be the opposite, right? Like, I don't think we should be teaching people to compartmentalize their emotions and to say, like, hold and save this emotion for later, because that can actually make them worse by, like, keeping them pent up. That's something I learned in therapy last year. Mm-hmm. It's actually what I think we should be teaching people is it's actually healthier to, in whatever situation you're in, say, I need a second to feel what I'm feeling, and it's okay that I'm feeling what I'm feeling, and I should be given the space as a human to feel this, to handle these emotions now, so they don't become a bigger issue for me later.
Yeah, and I absolutely, I 100% agree. And I mean, and if you've been in counseling, I did counseling for 7 years. So it's like, and that's how they teach you how to manage these emotions, right? I don't know what that is. I just had a hat appear on me.
It's just a gift.
Thank you. It's that handling of those emotions. Sometimes you can't. I mean, especially in these emergency industries, you can't take a second if I'm a police officer and I respond to a call of a child being held against their will at gunpoint. If I walk through that door and that person is aiming the gun at that child, I cannot, I can't afford to take a second to respond emotionally. I have to act. I have to compartmentalize that. Otherwise, this child's life could end. Right.
Sure, but
And
I don't know in this. I don't
where,
know in this instance that we should be worrying so much about like the high extremes. I think we should be talking more about like the majority of people in the regards to this conversation.
Yeah, sure. But it's at the end of the day, this masculinity, this aspect of masculinity is what develops these people in these positions. And so to try and change that, it's obviously nothing that you've said is saying that you want to eliminate it altogether. You just want people to learn about more healthy masculinity, not toxic masculinity.
Correct.
But I mean, even in like a mundane scenario, like an everyday scenario, like if I am walking my dog and I have a 6-month-old Doberman puppy who is very not reactive, but high energy around other dogs. And it's like, and if I see a dog that's not on leash coming at me, which happens pretty often, especially living in an apartment complex, I cannot be afraid for my dog. I can't sit there and be like, oh my gosh, like this big German Shepherd is coming after my puppy. I don't know what to do. I can't take a second, even in a everyday mundane scenario. It's like I have to act. And parents deal with this even more so, because things where maybe their child's about to touch the stove or like is about to fall off the counter or about to like do something, like they can't, there is no second. You have to, like, sometimes it just requires action without any regard to the emotion. And I think that's just inevitable with life, right? And that's why I think it's very healthy for there to be a overtly protective nature of masculinity to be taught to men in households, because it's like I always knew, like my dad, if it came down to like our family's in the face of danger, he was going to do whatever it took, and if he couldn't do it, I was next up as the oldest. Like it was then my responsibility to protect our family, and I don't think that's wrong. I mean, I would honestly let my mom protect our family over me, because she's ex-Navy and very just badass woman. It's like, and I would absolutely be like, I'd be comfortable hiding in the bathroom and letting her go take care of business, right? But in some cases, that's the truth. It's like in some scenarios, some relationships, the woman is going to be the more prepared emotionally, physically, and ability wise to handle those types of situations. But I think most of the time, generally speaking, the men are going to have an easier time of just acting in disregard of emotion.
So I just disagree on the implications of this, right? Like I think a lot of the things you brought up are things that I wouldn't necessarily say aggression would help. So for instance, like the situation with your dog, if I learned anything from Mr. Cesar Malone, it's you don't show aggression to an aggressive dog, because that's going to bring out further aggression in the dog. Mm-hmm. So I actually think the onset of aggression is going to be worse, right? Because you're going to further put your dog at risk. I think, you stated, staying calm, staying level-headed. Well, I would say those aren't tenets of masculinity. That bring, like, staying calm and staying, like, that's more tenets of femininity. And teaching women to remain calm in the face of like massive mental stressors is something that we kind of have taught them since like the dawn of time. Women are the gender who are taught to put on a smile and not show their emotions way more than men are, honestly.
But in terms not in terms of stoicism. I mean,
No, because
enduring
women
pain
women are taught to ignore those emotions. They're taught to put on a happy face, but they're not taught to ignore that stuff. Whereas men are taught to ignore it. The men are taught to just keep pushing. It's you know, if you want to beat depression, go to the gym.
Keep pushing it down.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I would agree that there is a very unhealthy version of masculinity that's very prevalent out there. I think we would both agree with that. I just don't think that, and this just goes back to my perception, and maybe it's just me not seeing enough like real feminists, but it doesn't feel, based off of the language that a lot of women use, that the goal is healthy masculinity. It often feels like the goal is elimination of masculinity, and that's really the only reason that this conversation is even happening, because it feels like that's what's happening, and because like men are being demonized sometimes for, or not necessarily men being demonized, but women are being demonized for taking up a traditional woman role by other women.
I disagree. I think what we're seeing is men are being held accountable. And I think to men, because of the way we've socialized men are socialized to have this level of entitlement and this level of superiority. And I think when men finally start facing repercussions for the things that they just genuinely do, they view it as an attack. Because they're it's like an entitled person who gets their comeuppance is going to view that as them being targeted. When what's really happening is we're finally having women stand up and say, hey, the murder rate of women by men is way too high. The rate of SA of women by men is way too high. And we're not going to put up with things that lead to that. And now men view that their whole lifestyles are under attack, which rightfully so if your lifestyles perpetrate well, I mean, mostly a form of like essay culture and things like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I could see that, and I could definitely see how that is the response by a lot of people, because they feel like the characteristics of grape culture, like locker room talk, like the bottom of the pyramid, the things that lead into that. Have you seen that graph, that pyramid?
Mm-hmm.
You know, yeah, like all the things on the bottom of that are just like normal things that, like, guys being guys, quote unquote, right? And so I can see how people are looking at that. But for me personally, I view it more as like my ideal relationship is with a woman who is going to be the caretaker of my family. It's like I bring her food and she turns it into a meal, right? I build a house and she turns it into a home. Like those are how I would hope to find a relationship with somebody someday. And obviously, if that never happens, then so be it. I'm okay with that never happening if that's not the way that it happens. But I feel like I'm in the wrong for holding that position based off of the rhetoric and things that I see.
I think you're in the wrong because you expect it. You know what I mean? I think what makes it the wrong position is that instead of going, I want someone to build with, I want someone who will share with me all what life has to offer, you go, I want to go get food and I want them to cook it. Even if they're not, like, what if you're the better cook? And what if they're the better, like...
Yeah, and I can see that, and that's like I'm more than happy like cooking, right? It's not just because I want I want a woman that will take up that more traditional role. Doesn't mean that I never cook, right? I mean, we're a partnership. We're in a marriage. We're going to sacrifice for each other. We're going to do things for each other all the time. It's going to be something that we grow together and we build together, and we do all these things. But in general, it's like the life that we're building is being at its like corest sense, where I am more of the provider protector role and they are more of the nurture and care and family kind of dynamic family culture role. But obviously that doesn't mean that she's never going to protect or she's never going to provide. And it doesn't mean that I'm never going to nurture and never going to care. I just think in general, within that relationship, those are the roles that we're going to slot into. But it's not exclusive, right? These aren't exclusive roles, but I feel like even by having that as an option, like even for having that as just like a general baseline, I'm like, I mean, you can even see the comments. People are just like, oh, he just wants to control women. He's a misogynist. He just wants to have the ultimate authority in the relationship. And people say these things, and it's just like that's not the heart behind it at all. It's like they're not exclusive, you know. It's like the roles within a marriage are traditional, at least in what I hope to find in my marriage someday, but they're not exclusive to each other. It's like there's going to be times and circumstances where we have to change roles, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that, and I just feel like I'm in the wrong for holding that position based off of my interactions with people on social media mostly. I mean,
I think there is nothing wrong with two consenting adults deciding they want a more traditional relationship. What I think is wrong is going into a relationship going, this is the type of relationship we have to have. And this is the type of relation, because it almost feels like you're prioritizing the things done for you over what makes a true relationship, which is like two people coming together and enjoying each other's company, enjoying like you're prioritizing more what your partner can do over who your partner is.
See, I feel like I'm doing the opposite. I feel like I'm prioritizing who she is more than what she does, because and that's why dating exists, because I can date somebody with these expectations of what I hope to find in my future permanent partner, and we can date, and then I can realize that she's not gonna align with my expectations, and then the relationship ends right then and there. And that's why, I mean, it doesn't need to be stigmatized to have expectations like that, right? I mean, because I can always, I mean, and I've said it before. It's like, if I end up being single for the rest of my life because nobody's going to meet up to these expectations that I have, then so be it. I mean,
I mean, yeah, like I said, I don't think preferences. I don't think preferences are
high.
wrong. I don't think it's wrong to have a preference. I think I just like to look at where preferences stem from to see if we're setting unrealistic goals based on archaic things. That being said, I did hear your timer go off, and I know I'm getting a little tired boy too. Do you have any final words you want to say before we end this night of debates?
Yeah, I always enjoy talking to people with different opinions, just because it challenges me and backs me into a corner sometimes where I have no choice but to concede that my line of reasoning and logic has failed. But I really don't have anything to say. I'll speak to any conservatives that are watching. If Jesus were to walk the earth today and the New Testament were to happen today, I just want to let you know that the modern day Democratic Party would absolutely love the shit out of him, and he would be the Trump icon of the left, and the right. The conservative Republican Party would absolutely hate him and want to hang him from the very cross that we did so many years back. And so I know that a lot of y'all conservatives will be offended by that, and I challenge you to press into that, into why you're offended by that, and then go and explore your own belief system, because it absolutely is the case. And Jovan's stance is probably more aligned with a biblical stance of how society should be than most Christians in America. And that's just the reality. And there's a lot of Christians out there that are not intellectually honest, sometimes maybe just out of their ignorance of the Bible, but I think most of the time it's because they are too selfish to acknowledge their own inequities. And It's a huge problem. It's why I like to come on here and talk with people who don't believe in God about all of these things. And maybe, just maybe, I can change one person's mind that all Christians are bad. If there's one person out there that thinks all Christians are terrible people, if I can change one of those people's minds and say, you know what, all Christians aren't bad. There was that David dude. He said he believed in Jesus, and he actually seemed like a genuinely decent human being. Then it was all worth it. And I appreciate Joven for allowing me to come onto his platform and have this conversation. I definitely learned a lot, and you made me have to really think about, especially when it comes to like where I assign rights to humans. And so I'm definitely going to take what you said, and really have to wrestle with that. So I appreciate you, Joven. Y'all have a good rest of your night, and yeah, that's it.
All right, David, you have a good one.
Hey, you too.
Thanks for stopping by. All right, and that was our David debate. What'd you guys think?